Castles are awesome, and one of the things that surprised me when I got to study them at university was how that wasn't a universal opinion. But one of the most awesome castles that I came across in my studies was one that immediately caught my eye as something special. It was Caerphilly Castle, a massive castle in Wales with some incredible defences sitting just north of Cardiff. As soon as I saw pictures of this castle, I wondered if it would be even cooler in person.
So I'm going to Wales.
I wanted to see this grand construction for myself, so I put some books in a bag, told a few friends I could visit them on the way, packed overnight gear and jumped in my car, ready to head on what really wasn't a massively long journey. And yet, I still came across my fair share of odd sightings.
And we're off! Lights green and away we go. There's a man in front of me with a bicycle that has massive tyres. Just past a man watering the hedge with his beer.
My interest in Caerphilly Castle first arose during a lecture at university. My lecturer was talking about different defensive techniques, and water defences were included in this.
Now we all know about the castle moat, right? The drawbridge, it's very medieval, it's very, it's a real part of medieval castle culture. Lower the drawbridge is, rings in your ears when you think of medieval fiction and fantasy and even non-fiction. But Caerphilly doesn't just build a moat. In fact, part of the structure of Caerphilly Castle is this massive walled dam that holds in the water surrounding the main castle.
When I got to see a picture of this dam during my studies, I thought this was one of the most awesome things I'd ever seen. Of course, this isn't just to look cool. Moats have a very important defensive purpose, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But why was this colossal structure built, and who built it? To answer that question, we first have to talk about the Marcher Lords. When William the Conqueror came over from Normandy and took the English crown in 1066, he moved to consolidate the borders of his new kingdom. He gave lands on the border of Wales to powerful earls in order to protect English land from any incursions from the clans living in Wales at the time. These powerful borderlands could also serve as a strong base for a Norman advance into Wales should that be desired. These nobles were called the Marcher Lords. Something I want to note here is that Wales wasn't a singular country. There wasn't a united country of Wales like there was England, although that wasn't quite so united either, and many different groups of people held land and claim over different parts of it. Interestingly, during these early years when these new lords began extending their lands into Wales, they were considered Norman invaders. A Welsh chronicle written well after these events even refers to these early invaders as the French and not the English. But invaders they were, and the Marcher Lords slowly started prodding and pushing further into Wales, building castles along the way to mark their progress and consolidate their power. Castles were a key tool in controlling an area of land, and so a great many of the hundreds of castles in Wales were built by the Marcher Lords. Much of this was even done independently of the crown, though certainly not against the crown's wishes, and often with the encouragement and/or support of the English monarchs. If, however, we were to look at the biggest castles in Wales, we'd notice that, unlike Caerphilly, not too many of them were built by the Marcher Lords, and were built a few years later than Caerphilly.
Not only have I solved the issue of needing more fuel, I've picked up some water as well. So I've solved the issue of needing more water. Now, Caerphilly Castle is a bit of an odd one, because it's quite an early castle. A lot of the biggest castles in Wales were built by Edward I when he conquered Wales.
Yes, previous me. Good point, although conquered is probably a bit of a complicated word here. Edward I's ambitions to unite the British Isles was only part of his reason for going on the offensive. A mildly successful rebellion that the Prince of Wales had taken part in had seen Edward captured in his youth, so he was probably thinking a lot about revenge as well. By this point, most of Wales was under the control of the English, and the remaining land was, for the most part, under the control of one family, the rulers of Gwynedd. During Edward I's time, the self-styled Prince of Wales was Llewelyn ap Gruffydd, and he had even been recognised as such by Edward's father, Henry III. Edward wanted Wales to fall entirely under his royal control. The issue with Wales was always its geography. This is also why it hadn't really been a united state. It was very difficult to control as a single entity. Wales is full of hills, valleys, mountains, woods and rivers, and this all meant that Wales had been incredibly fragmented even before the English/Norman lords started pushing in. The new English lords had taken advantage of their superior Norman military power and technology to slowly move in and start seizing land in the country. But the Welsh geography had also worked in favour of the locals. There was never going to be a single battle that could just knock out the Welsh leadership so the English monarch could swoop in and claim the country for themselves. So, where the borders of the slow baronial conquest of Wales reached was often dictated by how difficult the land itself was to physically control. The flatter and easy to access lowlands were swept up quickly, whereas the mountainous Gwynedd, with its hills, rivers and woods, remained more contested or untouched. Edward wanted to put a line in the sand and cement English control over the north of Wales, and he did this with castles. It's one of the biggest castle building programs in history. The eventual completed, or not so completed in some cases, castle network is a rare sight on this scale, even in mainland Europe. Edward's castles, built in two main phases, were built with a vast amount of wealth that only the king could afford. He essentially built a ring of castles around Gwynedd. Each one had an array of its own defences and carefully planned features, but they also worked within their own network. Edward's castles have many fascinating similarities to the Crusader castles. How Edward I dealt with Wales and the castle building programme around it is brilliantly engrossing history, but for another time. Because despite its size, Caerphilly is actually not a part of this programme at all. The castle was built between 1268 and 1271 by a marcher lord, Gilbert de Clare. It was constructed with a wider strategy in mind, as it was built as an outlier to help support and protect Cardiff.
So that's the castle we're going to see either tomorrow or Monday, and I'm very, very, very excited. I'm not sure if I'm going to be allowed in. Not because of anything to do with me, I just don't know if it's open. I should definitely have checked, but even if it's not open, I'm still going to go and look at the thing. After days of adventure through the harsh, brilliant landscapes of Wales, I finally arrived at Caerphilly Castle, and look, they've only gone and built a bloody tent on it, but it does look really cool. It's massive, it's so much bigger in person, as everything is, and I can't see the dam yet. Well, I can see the other side of it, but I want to go to the other side of the dam so I can see it as a dam, which I'm excited to do. And I don't know if I can get into the castle. The giant tent on top would suggest that maybe that's more difficult than it usually is. And if I can get into the castle, I won't necessarily if it's very expensive, because I can't be here for long. But, I mean, this looks really cool, run down and everything, but imagine what this would look like in all its glory. How would you invade such a thing? I mean, I guess I'll have a look.
Water could often be employed as part of a castle's defences, but there wasn't just one way of doing this. The moat is the most recognisable and well-known way, and nothing that I've seen, in person at least, comes close to the awesome moat, if it can even be called that anymore, around Caerphilly. Beaumaris, one of the grandest and most impressive castles built by Edward I, and that's saying something, also had water defences. Leeds Castle is another surrounded by water, but that may have been for more aesthetic reasons than defensive. I shan't go into the militaristic versus symbolic castles debate here, although I'll probably cover it another time. Water defences make it much more difficult to traverse the land directly around the castle, and therefore much more difficult to bring siege equipment up. Ranged siege equipment may have to be built further away, and constructions like siege towers are kind of out of the question. In addition, water defences like these stop mining, a tactic used by an attacking army where specialists mine under the castle structure and bring down walls and towers by mining away at the foundations. A moat wasn't the only way to increase a castle's strategic capability with water, however. Nearly all of Edward I's castles were built by the coast or by a particularly large river, which took advantage of a particularly important strength the English monarchy had against opposite combatants in Wales. England could call upon ships, although there wasn't really a navy back then, to reinforce, resupply, or even evacuate a castle under siege. It was also generally easier to transport larger amounts of goods or people to castles that ships could get to. This wasn't the case with Caerphilly, however, as the moat is not part of any large existing river or sea.
Only now, where I'm actually by the dam and the castle and I can see the kind of extent of the water features that surround the main castle itself, am I really getting a sense of just what a colossal feat of medieval engineering this was. I mean, even today, this whole complex looks incredible. And you've got some more modern features here, of course, that have been put in. I don't think that's medieval. This whole wall here is the dam that keeps all the water in, which is all part of the defensive structure, as much as the walls of the castle. I mean, it's fabulous, it's fascinating, it's incredible. And it's completely ridiculous. And also, trebuchets.
We've talked a little bit about the general political climate in which Caerphilly was built and how it compares to later castles built by Edward I. Let's get a little more specific about when construction began. I mentioned Llewelyn ap Gruffydd earlier, who had declared himself Prince of Wales and been recognised as such by Henry III, Edward I's father. This declaration was quite a triumphant one. Llewelyn ap Gruffydd had spent many years uniting northern Wales. He had done so by defeating in battle or otherwise subjugating various leaders around the country, including rival family members. It was only when he had the allegiance of the other Welsh lords, making sure that some transferred their homage from the English king to himself, did he call himself Prince of Wales in 1258. With the recognition of this by Henry III in 1267, Wales was, for the first time, a recognised state with a ruler from Gwynedd. Although again, I want to stress that it was not the size of the Wales of today, more so the northern part, and Llewellyn still technically paid homage to the English king. The English monarchy at the time had been weakened by internal division, and Llewellyn looked to be in an uncomfortably powerful position, and started building a castle at Dolforwyn, which he used to launch attacks against his neighbours in the south. It was in this political landscape that the massive Caerphilly Castle was constructed. The House of Clare, or de Clare, were one of the most prominent and influential families in post-conquest medieval England, until their extinction in the male line at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. They came over with William the Conqueror and were given control over a sizable amount of land in reward for their support. They constructed Clare Castle, which gave the family its name, and were, for the most part, heavily involved in the politics of the new English ruling class almost immediately. In 1217, the lands of Glamorgan were given to the de Clare family, and they had to fight for it. With the abundant resources and rather brutal drive of their house, the Clares pacified the local rulers who thought they could threaten their lordship over their new land. Earl Gilbert de Clare, known as Gilbert the Red because of the colour of his hair, was head of his house for much of the political turmoil of Henry III, and took a leading part in a fair amount of it. Initially siding with the rebels, he switched sides and played an important role in Prince Edward's victory at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Following the battle, the royal forces laid siege to Kenilworth Castle, a huge fortress that held out for 6 months, an extremely long time. One of the main defensive features of Kenilworth Castle was its extensive water defences, which helped limit the offensive options of the royalist forces and pushed their siege lines even further back. Llewelyn ap Gruffydd had supported the rebel Simon de Montfort in the war, and in the treaty he made with Henry III following the royalist victory, he believed he could assume control over lands in the north of Glamorgan, Red Gilbert de Clare's land, or at least Red Gilbert thought it was his land rather than Llewellyn's. With tension between the two rising, Gilbert started the construction of Caerphilly Castle in April of 1268, perhaps taking inspiration from the fairly impregnable Kenilworth. Llewellyn took this as a threat, and there were raids and counter-raids that eventually led to open warfare. In October of 1270, Llewellyn attacked the construction site at Caerphilly and destroyed an unknown but significant portion of what had been built. Work on the castle began again in June of 1271, and tension between Red Gilbert and Llewellyn was desperately mediated by external parties, not least Henry III himself, who had sent 2 bishops to take control of Caerphilly on behalf of the crown. While this was a setback for Gilbert, he eventually regained control of the castle, apparently with a rather fun plan involving 2 knights who requested access to the castle and then left the gate open for a small force of men-at-arms to take control in his name. Pleading ignorance, Gilbert was eventually allowed to retain control of his new fortress, and the clash over who had control over Glamorgan had gone in his favour. I've already talked about the brilliant water defences around the castle, but Caerphilly also adopted a couple of other architectural features that would become much more prevalent, especially in the larger castles around Britain. It was the first castle in Britain to be built with a concentric design, that is, multiple layers of walled defence. Many castles around the country would either be built with a concentric design, like Edward I's Beaumaris and Rhuddlan castles, and many castles, such as Dover Castle, were upgraded to have concentric walls. But another one of the features found at Caerphilly was the Great Gatehouse.
It's when you get to stand here and look at the entrance of the castle, do you really get a feeling of what the entrance to a castle is all about. Obviously it has defensive purposes, but one of the most important aspects of the castle is, as we've said before, its domestic features and its grandeur. You know, it stands here to be a symbol of the power of whatever lord holds it, potentially to be the symbol of the power of the king over different people, like Edward I's castles in Gwynedd. And when you're visiting the castle, of course, the entrance is the first thing you see, so you really want to bring that prestige, that grandeur, that power across. Caerphilly Castle is one of the first castles in the country that employ the use of a massive gatehouse, which would eventually become a really important and seminal part of castle building culture. Away with the keeping it in with just a gatehouse where you live, and it's very big and grand, and because it's the entrance, it's very important. But Caerphilly has a couple of entrances, because it has this entrance of the dam here, and it has the Great Gatehouse that you see as you go through.
The castle keep that had been so central in Norman castle building was already on a decline at the beginning of the 13th century, and in the next few decades and beyond, it would eventually be somewhat replaced by more elaborate gatehouses and defences towards the outer areas of the castle. The gatehouse became a more complicated and advanced defensive structure, and a more important residential and domestic one as well. The gatehouse in these later castles has even been dubbed, in many cases, the strongest point in the whole circuit of defence. But, again, the domestic side of things has at least equal importance as well, and the residential suites at Caerphilly's gatehouses were grand indeed. In the castle as a whole, there were at least 9 residential suites suitable for the lord or a high-ranking guest that might come to visit. It should be remembered that the grandness of the castle visually would have had no less of an effect on those who were around in the 13th century, and it was not simply a byproduct of its defensive capability. Caerphilly is a great example of the interconnected nature of the militaristic and domestic sides to a medieval castle. It had a clear militaristic purpose and offensive capabilities, but with that came an inherent prestige. It shows the differences in castle design between castles of the time in Britain and the more fort-like castles like those built by Europeans on crusades, and later castles like Deal, which we talked about in our Cannons and Castles video. It is also an interesting case study into how a castle is used militarily, and how effective it is as a strategic asset. One historian I read commented that Caerphilly, as a military structure, did not just end local warfare, it, and I quote, merely warned an enemy off a forbidden track. Unlike some particularly big castles like Dover or Windsor, Caerphilly has a fairly short in-use history. When Edward I became fed up with Llewelyn ap Griffith refusing to answer his homage summons and marched into Wales himself, the front line between the English lords and the Prince of Wales moved away from Caerphilly. It was still the administrative centre of the Declares, and did still see some action. In 1295 the town was attacked but the castle was unharmed, and in 1316 the town was destroyed and the castle was attacked, leading to some minor damage, mostly to one of the gatehouses. In 1326, Edward II took refuge in Caerphilly Castle after a rather catastrophic invasion from his wife, his son, and a bloke called Roger. He eventually fled the castle and was captured north of the town. The castle itself held up to a 4-month siege and surrendered in March 1327. After this, the castle wasn't really used much, and, despite repairs in the 1400s, It fell into ruin until it was obtained by the Bute family, who had a penchant for restoring old medieval castles in Wales, most famously Cardiff Castle and Castellcoch. Caerphilly was carefully restored using medieval building techniques, and the water defences were reflooded in the 1960s, which pretty much brings it to how it stands today. It's such an interesting castle, not just because of its size, but because of everything besides that as well. The water defences really are awesome, and I think there's definitely a debate there somewhere about whether or not Caerphilly or Kenilworth are the most like River Run from A Song of Ice and Fire. Its history is, perhaps, surprisingly short, but it still gives us a great look at the different functions of a castle, both military and otherwise. And while I didn't get to go and look around inside the castle this time, actually going and visiting this incredible medieval monument gave me just a little bit of a sense of what an effect it must have had on anyone who came across it in its prime.
Even today, hundreds and hundreds of years later, you really do get the sense of just how much of a power move building a castle is.
If you enjoyed this video, do leave a like and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content from this channel. Next couple of videos should be a bit of a collaboration with some awesome people, so I'm looking forward to being able to get started on those. If there's another aspect about castles, especially ones in England and Wales you'd like me to cover, then do leave a comment down below and I may be able to get round to it at some point. All the best to you, and I'll see you in the next video.